Good morning and welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder and this is BRNAM for Thursday, January 7th, 2021. And here are our top stories. Colleges and universities delay in-person instruction and higher ed inflation was 1.9% in 2020. Well, joining me now to discuss this and more is Rick Seltzer. He's an editor with Inside Higher Ed. Rick, Happy New Year. Great to see you, and thanks for joining us this morning.
Happy New Year to you and all of the viewers, and thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Let's jump in because as much as I can't believe it, we're talking about spring semester, and it just blows my mind. A lot of kids had off for Christmas and holiday break, however you want to term it, and now are looking back at school. But I recognize 2020 and 2021 probably are not the usual semester. So what can you tell us? What's going on now in the spring?
Yeah, that is absolutely right. It seems like we were just talking about closing the fall semester, and in some cases, we're just getting information on how the fall semester went, whether that's financially or tallying up what virus mitigation strategies worked. And already we have some places that are either welcoming students back for spring classes or now in many cases starting to modify their plans to welcome students back. I have not seen firm tallies yet, but I think it's safe to say that we've seen a significant number of institutions announce modifications for their spring plans as we have these very high COVID-19 infection totals and rates across the country. Some colleges and universities have been delaying the start of in-person instruction. Some have been pushing back the start of the spring semester entirely. And the difference there is if you're delaying the start of in-person instruction, maybe you're adding additional weeks of online classes so that students can come back to campus slowly, or in some cases not come back to campus until in-person classes start. The idea being gives a little more time to introduce students onto campus, maybe test for the virus over time, and just prevent that massive move of people and influx of folks all at once that can cause some chaos and potentially take an already high case rate and cause some problems locally or on campus.
Rick, last year we had talked about the fall enrollment and it was down slightly. I think kids were thinking about, or adults were thinking about postponing their enrollment. Is that the case, at least anecdotally, in the spring? I was thinking that people would delay maybe until the spring. The spring so far maybe doesn't have as much of a change as we had hoped, although we're just in January, so it's not like
right.
the year is over. But what can you tell us about possible enrollment?
Right. I've seen no firm numbers to suggest a break from what we've seen in the fall. And generally speaking, what we saw there was the institutions that tended to enroll part-time students, tended to enroll adult students, tended to enroll the students who maybe were not firm in their college plans are the ones that felt the largest enrollment hit. So your community colleges, your colleges and universities that don't have the biggest brand names are really the ones that we're seeing the most enrollment pressure, broadly speaking. There are always exceptions, but broadly speaking, that's the way it unfolded. I would expect that to continue into the spring semester. If you kind of game it out from the perspective of the student, things probably look worse now from an infection standpoint than they did back in whether July or August. The economy is kind of doing its chug along thing. I guess the only thing that would maybe push students to go back is if we have some changes to the social support network, unemployment insurance, or a stimulus package that wasn't big enough, a cash stimulus package that wasn't big enough, and they're looking for kind of something to do if they don't have a job and funding. Sometimes tapping college aid programs can provide you some funding to live while you study. Timing's not really great for you if you're a student making that decision, though. So I would expect a continuation of the trends that we saw in the fall, unless there's something major that happens in the next couple of weeks.
And what does this do to, Rick, to the financial? We have talked all year long about the financials for not only large schools, but medium-sized schools and even some of the community colleges. What does this continuation of the virus, maybe the reduced enrollment mean to the long-term financial health of some of these institutions?
Yeah, we're just getting some data now from the associations that represent these institutions in Washington. Now, these are the groups that tend to be lobbying for a support package. So sometimes the numbers are painted in a way that clearly will make it look bad for colleges and universities. Having said that, I generally trust what they're saying and they're saying that the costs have been very high in the fall, whether that is lost tuition revenue, lost room and board revenue that we talked about in previous discussions, and then also the actual cost of mitigating the virus if you're having in-person classes is significant. A couple of studies came out in the last few days that tried to quantify the ranges of what institutions are paying. It's hard because there are so many different sizes of college and university in the country, right? You have a couple hundred students all the way up to tens of thousands of students. But if you take, I believe one of the studies I saw was about 5,000 student college or university, and you add your social distancing measures, so reducing the number of students in a classroom and not holding those large classes, putting them online, pair that with masking and pair that with some relatively frequent testing. And the cost of this particular study put it in the terms of the cost of preventing an infection, an individual infection. It's about $170 per infection prevented with just social distancing and masking. And it's about 2,000 with lab testing plus social distancing plus masking. Now, a lot of the recommendations now are saying test more frequently than a lot of these colleges have been. So that number I gave before, $2,000 versus $200 roughly, is a pretty big difference based on testing that was already done. We're looking at ramping that up potentially into the future. So start multiplying that across hundreds or thousands of students, hundreds or thousands of infections prevented. You're into the millions for most colleges pretty quickly.
Yeah, and let's not forget the staff, the grounds crew, the people who are at the athletic department. Rick, last question. I mean, we've had the release of a vaccine. Now, that vaccine will probably go towards the most vulnerable, I would think, in those on the front line. But is there any talk about making it mandatory? You know, often many of us, when we were children, got the polio vaccine or maybe the chickenpox vaccine or some others to prevent us with some of these more widespread illnesses. Do you see this as a possibility where, you know, I know none of us are governmental experts and experts on the Constitution, but is this something that we could see down the line? Are they at least talking about this?
Yes, I'm actually just starting to hear some discussion from lawyers about this now. Very early ideas that I've heard, and again, I don't think this is worked out, just as you said, consult your legal advisor, but very early indications seem to be that it's going to be easier to mandate for students than it is for staff. There are a lot of reasons for that, but one of them seems to be that you have to offer staff under employment law kind of the reasonable accommodation. So if a staff member has a religious or health reason, maybe you have to offer them work from home or work in a dedicated space if it's available. All sorts of things. And for students, on the other hand, it's more established that you can require things like whether it's well, any of those vaccines that we've seen in the past that have been required at various institutions. I think when I went to college, for instance, years and years ago, you had to get a meningitis vaccine at Syracuse where I went. So that's relatively established. It's harder for staff. Now, one of the interesting things that we're seeing, the vaccine rollout is very different state by state who's prioritized. One interesting thing I just saw yesterday that West Virginia apparently allows some staff and faculty or some faculty and staff are being vaccinated already as of January, which is as early as I've heard anyone's plan being for faculty and staff. I don't think that's going to be the case for most states across the country.
Yeah, certainly interesting development. We'll be following that very closely. Well, Rick, I want to take a very quick break. Excuse me. When we come back, we'll talk to Rick about inflation in 2020 and what that means for college costs, staffing, etc. You're going to want to stay tuned right here on BRN AM. Imagine a new television network that will make you richer, healthier, and in control of your financial future. This network is for the policewoman in Nashville, Tennessee, the baker in Dubuque, Iowa, the teacher in Lexington, Kentucky. We want to make the idea of savings and retirement culturally relevant. But what do you see as a defining issue of the midterms, especially for the smaller businesses? I mean, they are the lifeblood of the American economy. Featuring exclusive interviews, current affairs, and docuseries. 33 years old, you retired early.
The philosophy is money only matters if it helps you live a life that you love.
But you got to start thinking about retirement as soon as you get in.
The Broadcast Retirement Network will drive very high engagement with premium partnerships. So this isn't retirement and savings for your parents or grandparents. This is for all Americans. And we're going to change the way you think about money. Welcome to the next frontier of retirement and savings. This is BRN, the Broadcast Retirement Network.
Hi folks, Joe Namath here, and if you're on Medicare, this is important. You're now entitled to eliminate copays and get dental care, dentures, eyeglasses, prescription coverage, in-home aids, unlimited transportation, and home-delivered meals, all at no additional cost. Plus, your zip code may have coverage with the Give Back benefit that adds money back to your Social Security check every month. Look, with the uncertainty of the virus and vaccines, you need to get everything you're entitled to. Here's the bottom line. Call to get significant benefits at no additional cost and see if your zip code has coverage with the Give Back benefit. Millions of people have trusted the Medicare Coverage Helpline. You can too. Call now. It's free.
Call 1-800-924-3920. That's 1-800-924-3920.
Welcome back. We're talking to Rick Seltzer of Inside Higher Ed. Rick, thanks for staying with us this morning.
My pleasure.
So let's shift gears. We talked about kind of the state at the beginning of the spring semester of higher ed, and lots of change obviously going on. Let's talk about inflation, because inflation in 2020 has an impact on 2021 costs, et cetera. What can you tell us there, Rick?
Yeah, that's right. And to your point, the 2020 inflation will not capture most of the virus costs that we are going to end up seeing this fall. The colleges and universities typically operate on a fiscal year that aligns with the academic year. So fall 2019, spring 2020. Yes, they sent some students home, had some costs associated with the virus in the spring, but by and large, this measure we're about to talk about doesn't count the biggest costs colleges are feeling. It's still important though, because it gives us a sense of where they've been, and it'll really be a good marker of the pressures they were under before the virus, which were significant already. This is a measure called the Higher Education Price Index. It's a measure of the inflation in the costs that colleges and universities are paying. So it's not tuition that students pay, it's what colleges are paying on things like salaries, fringe benefits, utilities, et cetera. In 2020, it came in at 1.9%, which is actually down from the previous year, from 2019, when it was 3%. So in other words, costs still grew for colleges and universities. They just grew less quickly than they had been in the last year, and actually the last couple of years. Why is that? By and large, it is because of utility costs, and it is because of other costs like materials that don't seem to be things that colleges and universities controlled, right? The costs of oil and natural gas really dropped last year, and that probably helped out with utility costs, not just for colleges, but for consumers, for all of us. And it will be important to watch going forward to see whether utility costs are low, but also whether bigger components of this index can be reined in. Faculty and staff costs, staffing costs are by far the biggest percentage of higher ed inflation, and they've soldiered on at roughly, I believe it's a 2 to 3% rate for many of the last few years. So good news, if you are a college budget expert, is that you had some relief from previous inflation levels. The bad news is you can't count on that going forward.
And Rick, what does this mean in terms of salary, cost of living adjustments? I'm thinking private sector, they're collectively, a lot of these institutions have collectively bargained employees, and then they may have private sector employees who are not collectively bargained. And then the second part of that is, what about public sector versus private sector institutions, or private institutions versus public institutions? Any anecdotes there you want to tell us about?
Yeah, so the split between public and private, I don't have good data on at this moment in time. What I do think is an important split to note is that the costs that are being felt don't necessarily translate to increases in compensation across the board. So what is happening right now is kind of a bifurcation of career paths in academia. So you still have your tenured faculty, but you have these institutions increasingly trying to rely on adjuncts, especially many of the kind of the new age institutions, right? Your online institutions have adjuncts who will teach at maybe 4 or 5 different institutions during a semester, and they're not full-time employees of any of them. So you have an interesting situation developing here where certain parts of the workforce are in a very competitive market, where you have people who are experts in whatever the hot field of the day is, or are doing great research, and there's a lot of pressure to compensate them, and compensate them well. On the other hand, you have pockets of very highly trained people who spend a lot on their education and aren't necessarily seeing a great drive for them to get higher salaries. By and large, the market has continued on with this upward pressure on the amount that institutions pay on compensation. The other element of that is that it's benefits too, right? It's fringe benefits. It's not just how much is going into people's pockets. What's happening with healthcare costs, either nationally or locally, really affects these institutional budgets too.
And what does this mean? I mean, if you can get a better deal, you mentioned these research institutions. If you're doing research and say you can get a grant at another school, are you willing to move? I mean, where does tenure? Where do you balance getting tenure, being on the tenure track, with moving institutions? I mean, are we going to see a brain drain, for example, from maybe more moderately sized institutions to some of these larger, for lack of a better term, richer institutions that have more money, get better grants, maybe a little bit more prestige in the eyes of some?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, we've seen in the last few years, and probably this has been going on before this too, but wealthy institutions will sometimes basically lift an entire lab or an entire group of academics and say, it's not just you, single faculty member, that we want to hire. We're going to bring a bunch of your folks, and we're going to help you set up effectively the same operation within our institution. So recruiting academic teams is becoming an important thing to do. And it is, I think it tends to be an upward funnel, if you will. The more prestigious, wealthier institutions are more likely to do that. I don't know. You could argue either way, and I haven't seen good research on whether that's a net negative for all institutions that lose that. There is sometimes an argument to be made that moving out the talent ahead of you actually is an opportunity for the new ideas that are kind of rising below that talent that was there. I think broadly speaking, though, the concern that you expressed, that middle of the market, lower end of the market, is going to be increasingly pressed for, whether it's tuition or research grant dollars, is one that we should really be worried about, because a lot of these institutions that are not prestigious are still doing really important work, in some cases better work than prestigious institutions, and they're under cost pressures that are just significant.
Yeah, look, I think this is something, I mean, you can look at the 1.9% and kind of be happy about that. But I think the longer term finances, as we talked about in the first segment and in this segment, has to be kind of concerning, and things that boards and other parts of the institution has to be kind of figuring out and thinking about long term. Well, Rick, we're going to leave it there. Always a pleasure chatting with you. I love talking higher ed and education with you. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll talk to you again very soon.
Hey, thank you so much. I'll look forward to it.
And that wraps up this episode of BRN AM. Have a topic of interest or someone you think we should talk to? Drop us a line. And don't forget, for all the information in retirement, markets, technology, personal finance, so much more, all in one place, check out today's edition of The Morning Pulse. So until tomorrow, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.
Are you being audited, and do you owe the IRS $10,000 or more in back taxes? Is the IRS threatening to take more of your money? Don't fight the IRS alone. The Tax Doctor is here to help you negotiate your tax bill and reduce your stress. The IRS can freeze your assets and seize your bank accounts, but you can stop these IRS actions. The Tax Doctor will work with you using our years of experience to represent your case to help you get the best resolution under the IRS guidelines. Help is here to deal with the IRS to reduce your stress. We've handled thousands of cases, so we know what we're doing. If you owe $10,000 or more in back taxes, do not call the IRS alone. Call a Tax Doctor now for a tax emergency analysis.
Call 800-224-6439.